All right, second video in our series on enhancing your point of sale, location, restaurants, retailers, store data with alternative trade area enrichment data. There's going to be a few more videos in this series. I'll talk about it at the end, but this one here is specifically on how to acquire that data. So if you watched the last video, if you haven't, go back and watch it because it's important for this video. But if you watched the last video, we talked about the Esri data enrichment product. That's one of the core sources that I use a lot. And we talked about how to go through and like find the variables that you might want to use in your analysis. So I'm not going to rehash that here. This one here, we're talking about how to actually pull that data. Okay. There's two ways to pull it. One is expensive, manual, no code. And then one is fast, efficient, cheap, and with code. And that's the version we're going to talk about. The no code method is something that honestly I haven't used in years. And I'm not even going to talk about it because I'm not up to date on it, but it's out there. It's part of the ArcGIS online product if you want to go explore that. But here, we are going to pull it with just a simple Jupyter notebook. If you can execute a Jupyter notebook, you can run this script. I'm going to talk through this real quick because we got a lot to cover and I got to keep this video under 15 minutes because that's all LinkedIn allows me to upload. Okay, so this notebook is in the Google Doc. So if you don't have access to this Google Doc yet, shoot me a message on LinkedIn or comment under this video in LinkedIn, and I will send you a DM with the link to this Google Doc, which contains the stuff from the last video, as well as the link to the last video, and it includes the stuff from this video as well. But the main piece of information you're going to be after is this Jupyter notebook, which we're going to talk about. Okay, so at the top of this notebook, there's some documentation. The first one here is this REST API documentation, which is the core of how we're pulling this data. Open that link, come to Get Started, Overview, and this Access the Service section will be your first step. Go in and set up an ArcGIS developer account, really simple. And then inside that account, you'll be able to set up an access token for this REST API. Go ahead and do that and grab that token because that's going to be important for the script here. Both of those things are really simple. You can work through them pretty quick. There's some service limits documentation in here. Most of you won't need that. It's just here for reference. And then I threw the links to our analysis variable finder and our data collection finder, which we talked about in depth in the last video, because those are important when you're actually pulling the data. Okay. Now I'm going to walk through this code real quick, and then I'm actually going to run a poll and we'll look and see what the data actually looks like. And then this video will be over. It's a pretty quick process here once you understand it. So first we're going to import our libraries. Nothing crazy here. I'm going to run this as I'm talking through it. This next section here is a pricing calculator. Okay. So this tool isn't free. You pay per use. All right. And I will say right up front, make sure you understand the licensing around this data because it's important. There's some rules around how you should be using it and how you should not be sharing it and definitely not reselling it. Okay. So go through that. Documentation is on Esri's website. You have to kind of hunt for it, but it's there. Go through and just make sure you understand that licensing. Most of the time, if you're using it for yourself and your own work and analysis, and you're not like distributing it, you're going to be in a good spot. But it does cost money. So I have not checked these prices in quite a while. It's been several months, so I don't know if this has changed. You might double check, but last time I had updated this, it's $1 per thousand variables and 50 cents per thousand variables on geocodes. Every pull I run, it's both pulling a data enrichment variable as well as geocoding the location that I'm pulling it for, because I use the geocode stuff quite a bit. And my location lists aren't always geocoded to begin with. The way to use this is you're just going to insert how many variables you think you're going to pull. So let's say I'm going to pull 10 variables for 2,500 locations. That's 26 bucks. Okay. It gets expensive though. If I'm going to pull 100 variables for like 15,000 locations, that's 1,500 bucks. Okay. So keep that in mind as you're starting to pull this. If you're pulling like the whole tapestry segment out of Esri, I think that's like that's like 75 variables or something. So if you're pulling that for, 10,000 locations, it's going to cost some money. All right. So keep that in mind. This is here to make sure you don't get like a runaway query that ends up costing you thousands and thousands of dollars when it's done. So that's just for reference. But the real meat of this is down here below. Okay. So the first step is to get our location list ready. Where I get a lot of my location lists is agdata.com. There's a link in the Google Doc to this website. A location list is about $100. So if you needed to grab like all the Target store locations in the US, it costs you $100. And so the first step, I'm going to actually restart this thing here just so we can run through it all fresh. The first step, let me run that again, is to grab our location list. So this is actually an ag data file, so you can see what the data looks like. There's a lot of stuff in here about each location, but really for the purposes of the Esri API, all we're interested in is these address fields, and we need to concatenate them together. So this is here for nothing else than me to be able to see what the file looks like, because I might have to use these heading names or something to make sure my concatenation is set up correctly, which happens in this next step here. And really, it's right there, okay? So these fields are already set up for this file, so I don't have to adjust them, but this is where you would make those adjustments. There's a little bit of cleanup logic and deduping logic that happens here before we dump this to a list that then we're gonna send to Esri, okay? What I will generally do in the early stages of any poll is pull a small number of locations first to make sure all my data is looking good. And that's what this line here does. So like if I run this, we get back a list of 4 locations, which is this 2 to 6 here. If I want all locations, comment that out. And now I've got all of my locations in that list, okay? We're just going to run it for 4 for the purposes of this. So I've got my list defined here. I feel good about that. It's clean, it's deduped. And then down below is where I'm defining my variables. And then I am hitting the API itself. All right. So first, to define my variables, again, go back and watch the prior video. But I'm going to come up here. And if I'm grabbing individual variables, I'm going to use this analysis variable finder. And for the purposes of this, let's grab 2 variables, 2 population variables. So let's grab total population, click that check mark, and then let's get daytime. Oops, I just want one of those. This top daytime population here. All right, so I've clicked the check mark next to both of those. I look here and I see which variables I have selected in case you're building a list of a lot of them. And then click copy CSV, and that drops this to my clipboard so that I can then just paste these really simply in between those brackets. Okay, that's all there is to it. So if you define like 10 or 20 or 30 variables, just click the check mark in each of them here, copy to CSV, paste that list in between these 2 brackets. All right. Same, slightly different, but similar process for data collections as well. You'll define the name of the collection here. And you see this is commented out. If you want to use collections, uncomment this, comment out your enrich vars, and then you'll do the same thing down below, which I'll show you. Okay. So we've defined our 2 variables that we want to pull. Let's go ahead and set that. And then down here is our actual hit to the API. And this is really straightforward. So the only thing you might need to adjust in here, one, if you're pulling a data collection, you will handle this. You'll comment out analysis variables. You'll uncomment data collections, which will do the same thing up here. But we're pulling analysis variables, so I'm going to leave that here. And then the only other thing you might think about changing is this buffer radius here. I have it set by default to 3 miles. I use 3 miles almost all the time because it's a tight enough radius to where I'm getting just the neighborhood around the location. If you start expanding that radius too far, your data will start to get washed out and every location will start looking the same. because you're just, you're grabbing too many people at that point. So keep that in mind. I mean, I have done analysis where I've done a 5-mile radius. I've even done some where I did 10, but those are pretty rare. You also, for you more advanced users, if you go into the documentation, you also can change the way you pull the data. So this is a ring buffer. So this is just a circle around every location. You can also define that circle based on drive time. So like if you wanted to say, I want to pull a buffer that is 10-minute drive time to my location, you could do that as well. You've got to make some changes here to do that. Okay. And then the other piece here, you will drop your API token in between those single quotes. I don't need to tell you can just copy and paste it in there if you feel good about doing that, or if you want to fetch it from somewhere securely, you could do that as well. The rest of this is just finishing out this loop. The one thing I did want to mention, you could comment out this sleep timer. I have not had an issue running into rate limits with the way this loop is set up. It runs fast enough for me, but slow enough to stay under any rate limits that Esri has imposed. So if for some reason you do run into issues, you could just uncomment this and see if that fixes it, or go with a more complex solution. And then we are dropping it to a data frame, dropping it to a CSV, and then the script is done. That's it. Okay, it's going to dump a CSV onto your machine in this directory. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so there's our 4 locations. Let me show you what the data looks like. So here, and then at the bottom of that snippet, we're also joining it back to our original data set. So like all of this here, all of this data is my original data from the original file. And then my Esri data starts right here at this ID column. And most of this data you won't use, but you see I've got my geocoded fields here. And I've got my 2 analysis variables that we pulled right here. Okay. Couple things on this. You can see really nice clean data set. You could easily join it to whatever data you're using for your analysis, which is kind of the point here. But these field names make sense to us because we're just pulling 2 variables. But if you are pulling dozens or hundreds of variables, this can get cumbersome. There is a way to query a cleaner variable name. You can find that in the documentation. So if you wanted to build something out like that, you could. I just haven't done it, honestly, out of laziness. But if you end up writing that in here and you feel good about it and you're willing to share it, I would love to have it, and I will drop it into this notebook so everybody else can use it as well. Okay, that's it. Now your data is ready. You've got your locations enriched. Join them over to your analysis data set, and you are off to the races. Okay. All right. So that is the Esri data enrichment piece. I think probably the next 2 we'll look at is probably weather and a proximity analysis. Yeah, there's several things we could talk about as far as alternative data, but this one gets you 70% of the way to anything you're ever going to want to do. Weather is probably for most of you, the rest of it. And then proximity is probably 95% of what you're going to want to do. And we'll cover all those in future videos. So again, if you don't have access to this, send me a message on LinkedIn. If you're watching this on YouTube, go to LinkedIn and find me. My name's Zach Pike. Just search Zach Pike, Magnetic Data Science, and you'll find me. Connect with me on there, send me a message or comment below this video on LinkedIn, and I will DM you the link to this Google Doc, which is what we're using to just continue to build on this over time. So you'll always have this documentation. In this documentation, here's the download link to the Jupyter notebook we just looked at. All right. Thanks, everyone.